Welcome back. This is our third part of our Microsoft Virtual Academy series on XAML. And we switched the order a little bit, so we're going to talk about panels next, so we can have a short session, then have a lunch break. And then we'll get back to controls afterwards. And we're also going to do Q&A for the past session and for this one at the end of this panels and layout session, because this is a straightforward one. So far we've talked about, shapes, and we've kind of been giving them sense of controls and buttons and borders and things that are happening. We haven't dived deep into controls, but panels is this kind of a special class that not everybody's familiar. Depending on what platform you're coming from, you might not be familiar with it.
Correct.
So the concept of a panel is very straightforward. It's all about layout.
Absolutely.
So a panel is just this one class. And it inherits from framework elements, so it has a lot of functionality, but it's not a control. And
pretty much everything you can draw on the screen inherits from framework element, right? You can really pretty much assume that, or at least UI element.
For UI element, for sure.
For sure.
And everything inherits to the top level from dependency object.
Exactly.
But the useful ones, you're right, like the useful ones are kind of framework element. We always say like the old saying used to be UI element is where life begins. So at the UI element, we have layout, input, focus, and eventing. And then at the framework element, we add the data binding, we add all the other stuff. And then at the control element, which we'll get to, we'll add the templating.
Exactly.
Right. But so this is a framework element, which means it has life. And their job is to just arrange objects inside of it.
Exactly.
So if you think about, for example, we're going to talk about grid, which is a table layout. Or we're going to talk about a stack panel, which is just, putting items in a kind of a sequential, in a, linear manner, whether it's horizontal or vertical.
Correct.
So the concept of layout is just positioning its children. Now, there's actually two interesting operations that happens when you're going to position something. In XAML, we say we have what we call a two-pass layout. The first pass is called measuring, and that's the parent. So let's imagine, I'm the parent, and I'm going to go in and look at all my children. Children are the items that are immediate, under my visual tree level, immediately under
the hierarchy of the XAML.
Yep. So I'm going to go over my children, and I'm going to measure them. Right. So I go through them and I say, hey, how much space do you want? How much space do you want? How much space do you want? And then once I know how much space they have and I apply my layout rules, then I can say, okay, now I'm going to arrange, which is, hey, I'm going to position you.
Which, by the way, again, puts the concept of tree in the focus, because the element in question, if that element has children, it also has to ask its own children, hey, how much space do you need, right?
Exactly. And it's all coming down.
Absolutely.
But we measure them once, and then we arrange them once. That's what it is. So when you look at panel, I got it right here on the screen, kind of the more interesting properties, which is going to be, it does have a background, because we want a layout. And remember, it's actually interesting because the hit testing only happens if you have a background. So if you want a panel to be transparent, but you want to hit test against it, just put a transparent brush, right? And then it has a children collection. You see right there, it's a UI element collection. And then it can also have transitions, but the main thing that you're looking at here is that children collection and then the arrange and the measure override. And I'm going to show you some custom panels at the end of this session so you can see a little bit of that, right? Now, I'm not going to talk about every possible panel layout because we have WPF, Silverlight and Windows Store, and we have kind of different options. But there's three that I call the core framework panels, which are Canvas, Stack Panel, and Grid. And those are kind of the workhorses of most of the layout. So we covered those. You'll be able to understand, you'll get layout really well, and you'll have kind of enough work, enough horsepower to be able to get any task done.
That's correct. If you think of the grid, by the way, quick segue into the design, right? The Microsoft design is strongly inspired from the Swiss design, and that makes me happy personally, and the German design, which are strongly grid oriented. So having a grid panel out of the box in XAML makes all that really very, very easy. And if you think about HTML, where there is not really this concept of grid, it makes things really harder to organize. So here in XAML, you have the full grid, full power, fantastic panel.
Yep, exactly. And so let's start with the basics. Canvas. Canvas is, hey, if we didn't have any layout, what would happen? And the reality is, if we didn't have any layout, everything would just go to 0, 0. And Canvas kind of builds on that and says, look, it's going to be, everything will be absolute positioned. Right now, we don't position with X and Y. Even though I have a X and Y coordinates, Canvas has a canvas left and canvas top and canvas right and canvas bottom property, and you can kind
Which
of
are
position.
attached properties that we mentioned earlier,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
So they're attached properties, and you can just position things that are in there. So for example, here, top left 0, 0, we would put the button there. Top right to be, the top would be 0 and right would be whatever the length of the parent or whatever the size of the parent is. It would go there. So this is just absolute position. This is the most basic layout that you could ever come up with.
By the way, earlier we talked about the render transform origin, which goes between 0 and 1. Not to be confused here, that is really a pixel value for the canvas. So you have a precise positioning. Yeah.
Yep. And then, so the next one is stack panel. And I'm going to go walk through all the slides first, and then I'll give you all of them in code.
Sure.
And SAML just stacks literally all the child elements together.
Yep.
And we can have a vertical orientation, or you can have a horizontal orientation, right? So you're just stacking stuff up in on one direction or the other. It's
By the way,
very
if you
simple.
just go back, I just wanted to mention something. XAML has something which is really powerful. You can actually have negative margins on an element. So if you have two elements which are stacked but which overlap on top of each other, you can actually set a negative margin on one of those elements and have them overlap this way, which is very convenient.
Yep, and we'll cover margin in 3 or 4 slides. But yeah, the negative angle is pretty cool. And then here's the workhorse, grid. And this is a table layout. So here we're going to have row definitions and column definitions. So you're kind of just defining columns, defining rows, very much like table layout in HTML. A little bit familiar, if you're familiar with that. And for example, here I have 3 rows or 4 rows. So you can see here, like, you saw the animation. I can go back and say, just animate a row equals 0, row 1, 2, and 3. You got
starting
all your
at 0,
and
right?
else.
Don't get confused.
And here, the rows can be defined by many different things. They can be defined in pixel sizes. They can be defined as percentage. I'll get to the demos and I'll show you. So for example, I had this button and I wanted this button to take over these whole 3 rows. I can just say button row span is 3. I can also go in there and declare something with a color span of 2. I can mix those 2 and match them, right? So I can do a lot of that mixing and matching as we go. Right? I'm going to give you a couple more properties that affect layout, and then we'll dive onto layout for all of them, so you can see a little bit of what are what's happening there. So obviously, when you think about layout, width and height matter.
Obviously.
Now, if you look at our platform, something you'll see this extra property called you'll see this extra property called actual width and actual height.
Correct.
And what happens there is, so you can have, we're going to do dynamic layouts a lot.
Yeah.
So sometimes
because width is actually, I said before that pretty much everything is a double in XAML. But width is actually not a double. It's actually a length element, which can have a value or something else, right?
Yep, exactly. Or sometimes you just don't set the value of something, and then actual width and actual height. After we've measured and arranged, those values will be there, and you can just query
set by the
them.
parent or set by the constraints.
Exactly.
Like if you have a button with content, and you set the width to auto, it's just going to take the width of the content. Yeah.
Some more properties we have: alignment, margin, and padding. And I'm going to walk you through all of them here. So alignment just positions kind of. It determines the position and the stretch of an element. So for example, I can say, look, align this element to the left, or align it to the center. If it's a horizontal alignment, I say left, center, right, or I can just say stretch, which means take as much space as I can.
Yeah.
And all of this, if you have dynamic layouts, is really useful, because then as things resize, you don't have to worry about it. You can just say, stretch me to whatever space I have.
Yeah, think of the new feature on Windows 8.1 where you can actually have 2 applications side by side and then move the divider. So that's very dynamic layout, and if you use that, it's really easy to do.
Yep. And then very much like horizontal alignment, we will have a vertical alignment, top, center, bottom, and stretch. You'll see this in action in a minute. The next property that we have is margin. And margin, it's interesting. Margin is kind of one element saying, hey, this is how much space I want between you and me. It's kind of our personal space.
Yeah.
Right? We can only be so
here
close.
We have a margin of about 150 centimeter, I would say, right?
Yep. It's so yeah, 4 feet is what we say in the States. And
yeah, well, okay.
So, but the margin is kind of like it's external, right? So for example, right here I have these rectangles, and this yellow one right here has no margins. So and they're in a stack panel, so they're kind of oriented horizontal. And So this yellow one has no margin, so the green is immediately right there, kind of like crowding him almost. Right, and again, if you had done a negative margin, you could, it could even
overlap.
be over. Yeah,
Overlap,
they could
yeah,
be overlapped. Right, and then the next rectangle, this green one or this yellow one that comes in third is saying, hey, my margin is 30. Now, there's all kinds of different margin properties. Here, I'm using the short syntax, which is 30, but I can do left, top, right, bottom.
Yep.
And it starts left, top, right,
and have
bottom.
different values for those four elements.
I remember it with letter, LTR. That's kind of how we lay them, because HTML starts with top, right.
In CSS, it's starts at the top, exactly. Yeah.
Yep, but here, so here I'm just using the short syntax. So here everything will have a margin of 30 everywhere.
Side.
If you use the short one, if I had said 30, 50, then it will be 30 on left and right, and then 50 on top and bottom.
Correct.
But that's just, I'll show you more syntax as we go. But here we have, the second rectangle is 30 pixels away from the first, because that's what he said. And you still see that it's still not getting constrained, because in the horizontal stack panel, we're defining a height, and it's still pretty, there's not enough margin for us to have to shrink him. The next one right here is the yellow, or this green one right here, and it's got a margin of 50. So here what you see is, between this yellow and the red, we have 80 units, right? We have the 30 and then the 50.
Plus the 50, yeah.
Right? So they're kind of adding up. And then the very last one is this yellow one, and it's got a margin of 80. Now here, because it's got a margin of 80, and it's on top and bottom, you see that we kind of shrinked him a little bit.
It's pushing everything,
right?
because, exactly.
It's pushing. And in this case, it's actually not pushing him because he has a fixed height of 100, but the layout is clipping him.
It's clipping,
Yep,
which
exactly.
can be sometimes a little bit annoying. So if you see this kind of things happening into your UI, that's what you want to look for. Where do I have too much margin and maybe not enough height and width in the container, which causes everything to clip? Yeah, that's possible.
Exactly. Now, so that's margin, and margin is, hey, how much space is between two sibling elements, external space. The next one right here is padding, which is, hey, I have something inside, right, with my children elements, whether it's a panel or like, let's say you have a border, and the border is saying, look, I want some space between me and whatever is inside of me, and that's what padding is. It's just empty, it's a space that will be empty, but inside of it. So for example, right here, this first border has a padding of 40, and you see here, a little bit of space everywhere. And then the second one has, padding of 100 on this, which is a kind of a, you see a lot more space here. And then on the top and bottom, it's only got a 5.
Yep.
So you see that it's, it's getting much closer to the edges.
And only certain elements have padding. So here we have a border, which is, it's not a panel, so don't get confused. It can have only one child, but it's a container, right? So here you can set padding. You can set padding on a button, which is going to influence the ways that the content of the button is rendered, but not every element. Every element has margin, but not every element has padding.
Yep, exactly. So here I'm going to switch on to Blend and just walk through a couple of samples there, and then just to give you kind of exercising a little bit of those layouts. So we'll go here. Brand new project. I just did file new project. Layout, for me, Blend is very, very useful for layout. And I'm just going to come back here, go to 50%, bring in some of my views so you can kind of see a little bit of the SAML and the items as we go. So I'm just going to go in there and kind of define some pretty basic layouts here. So it's all about drag and drop. So we begin here. Let's drag something like a grid. So I can come back here and I'll just drag a grid right here. And for example, within Blend, I can come back here, and you see here, if I hover over the edges right here, I can define my rows this way. Right? So I'm just going to define 4 rows, and I'll just do 3 columns exact same way. That's one way to do it. And you can see here, now these are all as a percentage. Right, because I defined 3 columns definitions and 3 row definitions. These are hardcore percentages. So as the screen resizes, this UI will shrink and grow as we go.
Yeah. So to be absolutely exact, right, if I may say, because it might confuse the people that it actually doesn't add up to 100. So it's not a percentage per se. It's actually a proportion between the value. So if you have the first one is 40 star, the next one is 35 star, it's going to be a little bit smaller, and the next one is 49 star, it's going to be a little bit bigger, right?
Yep. So for example,
doesn't have
here,
to add to anything, basically.
for example, here, if I add everything 40, now they're all the exact same size.
Exact same proportion.
Right? Now, for example, here, so this is 40 star, right? So that's kind of a 25% for each. Now, if, for example, I say, look, let's make this a fixed height. So from here on, when I set the height to 40 pixels, he's going to be small, and he won't resize no matter what.
Exactly.
And then what you see...
remove the star here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what you see here is that, you know, the 40, the other ones are still the same size because it's 40. It's a proportion of the leftover space. So star is like, hey, what's left over?
Yeah.
Right? And that's what grid will let you do.
And this is super useful because when you think about it, right, sometimes you want to have a small border on the side to do some kind of visual effect, right, like a deep blue background or whatever. But then after that, you want the rest to resize really dynamically. And if you have a very large screen, you don't want this border to be very large. You want it to be still like 10 pixels or 12 pixels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go I'll add a little rectangle here. And you'll see a couple things first. First of all, I'm using Blend. So you'll see that Blend tries to be smart about it. So it knows, like, it saw me drag it, and it saw me do all the things. So it added all the properties that it saw me do. It's doing its best to think about all the things that we just showed. So for example, here, and let's just focus on that rectangle right here. You'll see that just by dragging, Blend did a lot of the work that we needed to do, right? So I have my rectangle here, and it says, look, you want horizontal line to be left and top because that's what it kind of saw me do. It saw me draw, and it gave me a height. Now I can change it, for example, here, and I can change it here in the SAML, where I'm just going to say horizontal alignment is stretch, right? And that will automatically change it. Now, notice that right now it's stretching, but there's still the margin property, so it didn't take over everything. If I just come back here and get rid of that, you'll see that, you know, now it's actually taken. Now it's still looking at it.
Save and yeah.
Yep. So you can see here, and I can come back here. By the way, I'm editing them in you know, by hand right here, but I can also come back here and do them here.
Yeah, and by the way, there is also a nice feature in Blend. If you right-click on your rectangle, there is also reset all, which is really nice, which allows you, if you draw, it will have margin, alignment, it will have a whole lot of things. Reset all just resets everything, and then you have everything set to automatic.
Yep. And you'll see here, for example, here it didn't stretch earlier. It didn't, when I say horizontal alignment stretch, it didn't stretch automatically because there was a width property.
Oh, yeah.
And that property was overridden. But now I can come back here, right here under width, so I can change it to be width 200. And you'll see that it will automatically, if you tell it to stretch, it'll center it for you.
Which is a pretty complex scenario because when the grid says, hey, how much do you want, right? The rectangle here says, well, okay, I want stretch, but I also want 200. So what wins? So that's the rectangle's own problem to decide how much do I want, basically.
Yep, exactly. And here, for example, I also have a row span. So I can come back here in the same rectangle. Let's say that I went back and I just did a vertical alignment right here. And I also set it to stretch, right? You'll see right there. Let's get rid of this height. And you'll see now it's taking over the first row. Now I can come back here and say, oh, my row span is 2, my row span is 3, and control everything like that. And again, the beauty of this is that as we resize on the screen, and this will be very, very important on Windows because Windows, you know, most modern PCs are definitely like 1366 by 768 is what we kind of designed for. But on Windows, we have the multi-window scenarios. We have very large displays. We have everything.
Multi-PPI scenario where one monitor can be one PPI and the other one is another depth. Yeah.
So you're going to see all of this come back and forth. On Windows, this will matter a lot. That's why everything we do is a dynamic layout on Windows.
Correct.
Windows Phone has kind of like 2 resolutions. Or
more or less, but I mean, think about just rotating the screen and then suddenly everything changes. And if you use dynamic layout to do that, you really simplify your life quite a lot.
Yep. So that's a little bit of the interactions. You see the alignment. In this case, I didn't have any padding, so I can go back here and, for example, move these elements inside a border because grid wouldn't have any padding. But I can just come back here.
Oh, you can do that much easier.
Oops.
In Blend.
You want me to wrap it?
Right-click and then...
well, it was 2 rows, so...
well, still, right-click and then group into border.
Group into border.
Voila, you see Blend is really fantastic.
And it added it right there. And it actually took a lot of the properties that were in the panel.
It's very clever.
Right, and now, for example, now I can go back here.
And say padding equals...
Padding equals 50. right? And you see that it's just padding it. And you can now see the context. So if I do 50, that's good. If I do 50, 10, now it's going to be 50 on the top and right, or 50 on the left and right, 10 top and bottom.
Correct.
Or I can just go crazy here and say,
set all
like,
the four
set
value
all of them one right
yeah.
here and like this. Now, if I can also say, for example, I can do margins and padding such that the thing becomes invisible because it's so far off the screen. If
because it's going to be clipped totally.
Yep,
yeah.
Exactly. So you're seeing all these things. And then the last one that you have is you also have a visibility property, which will affect layout because items can be visible or collapse. And if your items collapse...
Like if you're seeing in the stack panel, for example, if you have something which is stacked and then you collapse it, of course, the rest is going to...
The rest of them move.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a difference between visibility and collapse. Like visible, like if you put something visible with opacity, so transparent, it can still take space.
Sure.
But if it's collapsed, it doesn't take space on the layout. That's where the measure and the
And WPF even have a hidden value for visibility. So if you ever wondered why is visibility not true or false, it's because WPF actually has a hidden, which means it's not visible, but it's still taking space, right?
Yep, exactly. So that's a little bit of layout. So you get it. Again, grid is the more dynamic one. Stack panel is just going to stack items. I guess I could do real quick a stack panel here. I was going to do a reset quickly. Actually, let's do it. But this will, so let's just do it this way. Well, we only have one element is the problem. So I can just come back here and change it to be a stack panel. And then we'll add more elements. As
always, the blend XAML editor is a little bit less powerful than the Visual Studio editor. In Visual Studio, if you do that, it would actually go and change everything for you and very neatly. It's very convenient.
And that's what I was after. But so I'll just create a new page here. And I can do the exact same thing that we did earlier. So I can just add a stack panel. And then here I can just add different elements as we did earlier. So I can go back here. And I can just start adding, like I'm dragging a rectangle, so I was going to add a couple, and I can, for example, just add a text box. And right now they're being stacked in the vertically manner, right? I can go change them and set the properties. So right now I added a text box right here. Let's just increase the font a little bit so it takes a little more space. And you see that they're stacked. I can come back here onto this text box
select
right
the
here.
stack panel,
and change, like for example, add some margins onto it. And you'll see that it's going to affect everything we had. So you'll see here, if I go margin top, it's just going to start going a little bit farther away from the rectangle.
Yeah, which is great, by the way, when you build this kind of, like line of business applications where you have always like label, text box, these kind of scenarios.
Yep, exactly. So you'll see here, this layout is very, very straightforward. All you have to do is like use the core layouts that we have.
Correct.
Again, we have a lot more than the 3 that I showed you. I showed you the 3 that are across all platforms and the 3 that are kind of the workhorses for everybody else. I do have a sample
and everything can
here.
be put inside the scroll viewer as well. So if you have really the problems that your screen is actually smaller than your content, you can just put everything into a scroll viewer and have the scrolling.
Yep. And the last thing I want to show you is this concept of a custom layout.
Just close this one and not okay. Just close it.
Okay. Well,
okay.
Let's just let it.
You like risk. I think it doesn't actually do anything. It's just telling you that you should think about it.
Yep, I've added the. So and this is just I'll show you the concept. I'll show you the concept first. This actually came from Wintellect. It's one of their samples. Jeff Precis and Jeffrey Richter.
Hey Jeff.
Hey guys. I stole one of your samples. And these are just, they show you different layouts. At some point, all of us have written 2 or 3 of these. When Serialize started, we all wrote these 3 or 4 that we learned from. But it's useful, and they just show you different layouts here. So for example, like this is a radial panel. And you'll see here there'll be a radius property, and you just define the radius, and then it positions all elements around. It divides, it takes the 360 degrees, divides it among the number of items that you want to lay out.
And the beauty in that is that the element itself doesn't know about it. It just, the panel is taking care of arranging them, but the element itself doesn't have to know.
Yep, and that's where attached properties and all these extra dependency properties come in, because a border doesn't need to know about radial panel. It cannot know out of every possible panel.
No, absolutely.
So that's kind of where we're at. So this is one example. This is another one where they have, it's the exact same concept, but it's a radial panel. It's the exact same layout as before, but this time they're just laying text boxes. So again, you see the power and flexibility on WPF, and this is your standard carousel control.
Yeah,
right?
it's
So,
with how do you say, you skew it, so basically you do
Yep.
one of those
There's a little bit of a
2.5D.
projection going
Exactly,
on here.
exactly.
So I'm just showing you these because I want to make sure you know that the layouts are very extensible.
Yes.
Right, so if you look at the code, which again we'll put on our, or actually we'll put a pointer to, or we'll link to there so that we don't kind of go in there. But for example, if you look at the code, there's nothing but everything I just described. So I have a radial panel, inherits from panel. It's got dependency properties right here, for example, radius and rotation, so that you can, and a little bit of speed and a few other items. And they're all dependency properties because they need to be data bound, they need to be styled, they need to be everything else.
Yep.
So this is a great way to learn about those concepts of dependency properties. There's no attached dependency properties on this one, but you can get familiar with dependency properties and the system. And then at some point here, we'll get to the meat of this, which is the measure and arrange.
Yeah.
And you see here that the way you declare, or the way you create a custom panel is just override. So inherit from panel and then override the measure override and the arrange override methods.
And notice that we get, everything is in size, so it really illustrates what we do here. We say, hey, how much space do I have at my disposal? And you say, well, how much space do I actually need? And there is a whole lot of of hierarchy going on to decide who is actually taking precedence on that.
Yep. So here's so you have a measure override method and an arrange override. Measure first, then arrange is kind of the rule. And you'll come back here and see it's looking at its available space, and then it's actually measuring the children with how much they need, which this is pretty much going to ignore. It's just going to tell them you have as much space here, and then it's going to arrange them in there. So,
yeah, I bet there is pi somewhere there.
Yep, exactly. There's definitely a 360
there must be
degrees
pi
and
somewhere.
radians and a pi.
Correct.
But that's where we're at. So you have the examples for custom panels. Panels are extensible. And that's it with regards to layout. Windows, everything Windows and Windows Phone, dynamic layouts is super, super critical. Right? If you come from HTML is very dynamic anyway. If you come from like an Xcode world,
they pretty much invented
where it's
it.
iOS, and they do have a little bit of paddings and kind of like layout constraints, but not as much. We use the concept of panels, which are going to be these workhorses that all they do is lay everything out. We use them a lot. So become familiar with these three and become familiar with the properties that we gave you, and then you'll understand layout very, very well. So that's it for panels. I want to go back to Q&A because in the last sessions we went over, and I want to make sure
just
people
a tiny bit
are not too discouraged saying, hey, they're not getting to any of our Q&A. My guess is that, again, we have Matthias Shapiro, Nisha Singh, and Nikola Metulev discussing all this stuff, so are answering the Q&A, so I doubt there's a lot. But we can answer a couple, and feel free to, I guess the reason I'm going back to Q&A is I want people to continue to submit.
Yeah.
Don't give up. If we skipped it last time. Really quick, what's advice to who's starting in Windows Store development? Is it better to go to Windows 8.1 and Visual Studio 13, or is it something, or should we start with Visual Studio 12 and Windows 8?
Yeah, personally, I would start with the latest. There is really a lot of improvement in 8.1 that you are going to want to take advantage of, and there are also a few features that are actually deprecated in 8.1 over 8. So if you have a choice and your project is not like, okay, I have to release in August, right?
Exactly.
I would probably go with 8.1.
So I think I'll second that, but I'll caveat it the other way around, which is it comes down to when you ship.
Oh, of course.
Windows 8 is on market today. Lots of people making a lot of money on it. Right? So if you want to wait, if your project is going to take 4 months to write, and I'm not saying that Windows 8.1 will ship in 4 months, but we know that Windows 8.1 will ship before the end of the calendar year. If your project is going to take 6 months, then starting with 8.1 has a lot of advantages because number one is you do have new templates. We do have new properties. We've optimized quite a bit. So you're going to be optimized right from the beginning. You don't have to migrate your code, change anything as we go. However, Windows 8.1 won't ship until end of the year. So if you need to go sooner, go to 8.
Yeah.
Now, to go back to your point, you make up something interesting, and one thing that you saw was me. I'm running Visual Studio 2013, I'm running 8.1, and I can open, you saw that prompt right there that says, hey, maybe you should upgrade.
Yeah.
So one thing that you could do is you can install Visual Studio 2012, do File, New Project, and that way you get Windows 8.1 templates with Windows 8.1 features, right? And then you can side by side install Visual Studio 2013.
Absolutely.
And as long as in Visual Studio 2013 you have not upgraded your project, you can continue to target 8.
Yeah, because 8.1 is going to run 8.0 applications.
Yep, and 8.1.
Yeah.
So so as long as you don't upgrade your project, you get the benefit of the new tools, but you're still using the old templates and the old features, you know.
One thing that I wanted to say, we had this dilemma, you know, between Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 8, but here the scenario is very different because Windows 8.1 is going to be a free upgrade, which is going to be available to pretty much any machine that you already have. So for the user, it's not going to be, oh my God, I have to buy a new device, right? It's going to run on the device you already have. It's going to be free. People are mostly, it's going to be brought by Windows Update, so it's going to be pretty seamless. And I think that it makes sense to keep that in mind. But you can also very well start with 8.0, and like this, you cover really all the bases and then upgrade to the new features. When
if you're
ready.
shipping before 6 months, start with 8. And use the upgrade if you want. If you're shipping after 6 months, start with 8.1 because then you have the better templates. They're more optimized, and we did deprecate a few features, or some features are just no longer needed. So there's things that are changing there that you would want to start with the right one.
Yeah.
But I would say, you know, don't wait because your competitor is probably not waiting.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So that's one question. Let's tackle a couple more, and then we'll give them a kind of a lunch break. Or a meal break. Yeah, for those that are not in the U.S. So this is a really great one that I definitely want to emphasize because we've been talking about this a lot. Surface RT. So the question is, Surface RT, does it run SAML apps? Right?
Yes.
And I'm rewording it. It says Surface RT does not run Silverlight. Does it run SAML apps? And actually, you run that Surface RT.
That's my RT, exactly.
Yep,
and I have a bunch. I cannot show it because it's not wired, but I was running Twitro before, for example, which is a XAML C# app. I have the Twitter app that you showed runs on that as well. So absolutely it does run a XAML C# application. It's correct that it does not run Silverlight, but to be honest, the Silverlight scenario is a scenario that you probably don't really need so much.
Yep.
I would rather recommend to just go for in the Windows Store, get the full app, and then you have all the goodie, all the additional experience of that. Exactly. And it has a great battery life, by the way, so it's really nice.
Yep. So Surface RT is the OS that runs on ARM, and it has a full-blown Windows Store stack. So everything we're discussing here, the apps that I showed you, like I didn't show Netflix, but Cocktail Flow, Twitter, all of those apps that are from the Windows Store will run fine, and they're being written with SAML. So we definitely support it on Surface RT. Great performance. Especially in 8.1, we've made a lot of improvements in that space. So so there's a lot of really great stuff coming there.
Yeah.
And that's why we're running.
A lot of flexibility. You can have like 2 applications side by side at the same time. You can watch a video while you're doing some, some Excel editing. You have the full Office suite, including Outlook, by the way, which is new, right? So it's a very good device. I'm really happy with it.
Yep. So I'll take 2 more questions just because these are going to be deferred to later, and then we'll take the last one. So somebody asked, are we going to talk about debugging data binding? And we're definitely going to get into data binding, do a lot of demos, etc. We're not going to get too advanced into the debugging, or pending time. We'll see how far we get, but we're not going to go too deep. If you have a question, feel free to ping, Laurent or me directly, and we'll try to answer it. If with the content we show you today, we don't get into it.
Yeah, best scenario is probably over Twitter. I would say you have our Twitter on the screen
right
now, but
Twitter
it comes on and off. So that's a good scenario.
So that's one.
Exactly.
And then there's this question here, is there a native MVVM framework in .NET? And the answer is no. Microsoft still hasn't shipped an MVVM framework. We believe that, especially and this is, I'll believe, is not, I won't speak for all of Microsoft, but I believe that MVVM is like a religion. Everybody has their own favorite one.
Which, by the way, maybe not everybody knows what it is. So we'll have a whole section about MVVM pretty much at the end of this course, right? It's a pattern to build application. You can build application without it, but if you want, I'm going to show some examples.
So we're definitely going to have an MVVM session, and it's going to be 100% MVVM Lite.
It's actually not correct. I'm totally agnostic. I don't use MVVM Lite because I want to illustrate the concept. But you can do everything I show easier with MVVM Lite.
Yeah, fair. So we're going to focus on the MVVM Lite is what I was after. But there's other frameworks out there
correct.
that are not Microsoft.
Yeah,
Microsoft
we'll talk about
doesn't
those.
have one. We'll mention all of that. And then there was one more question, and I think this has been kind of answered, but I want to make sure I address it because we're spending all day training people on SAML, and I want to emphasize it. Why SAML is a little more complicated than using HTML5. And again, I think we talked about it earlier, which is, to me, SAML has a lot more power than what you get. Like, SAML is a bigger framework, has a lot more power than what you get out of like just basic HTML elements. SAML can be as simple as HTML if all you want to do is drag and drop 5 elements and do, like handle an event and drag, so drag and drop 5 elements, handle an event, and do a little bit of coding. So we're not much more complicated. There's a lot more power where today we're going under the hood, teaching you a lot of everything. So you're going to learn a little bit more. But I always tell people, like, and Lauren, you train people a lot too. Usually for me, is you spend 2 days learning the cores of SAML, then you start practicing, getting more familiar, and you're there, right? There's nothing like, it's not like you're learning, like when you learn how to ride a new car, drive a car, you spend the first 3 or 4 days learning the concepts, and then afterwards you can drive any car, right? And I think there's a little bit of that here where the concepts of layout, the concepts of, data binding, all these things, if you come from a platform that has them, you should be familiar with it. It's just the implementation.
Yeah, and don't forget the power of the tools. I mean, we showed you quite a lot of Blend. We showed you Visual Studio. We said that it's, it has really awesome IntelliSense. Blend is very visual. You can have the split view, so you can learn easily, okay, if I change these properties, what is happening in the XAML, what is happening on the screen. So you have really a lot of very nice helpers, to accompany you, to bring you basically to the goals that you want. So it's very beautiful.
Yep, exactly. And then there's a last question, and then we'll go to a meal break. Somebody asked, because earlier we did the demo where we had this text box, and then we had kind of the the slash that closes the tag, or the more verbose, closing the element,
the self-closing tag, or the
and somebody says, what is what's kind of the recommended or?
Well, it depends. I used to say it really depends how Swiss you are. Maybe, I mean, Swiss people like order, so I like to have self-closed elements because it always disturbs me when I have like a naked slash text box somewhere. But honestly, it doesn't make any difference. It's not going to impact the way that your application runs or the time that it takes to start. It's exactly the same. But if an element is empty, personally, I like to have a self-closing one. It's just a matter of being Swiss.
So I like naked stuff. But I still like the closing tag.
Good for you.
So no, I'm actually I like the closing tag too. So I say I keep my SAML as concise as I can. As readable.
In many cases, it's not actually really an issue, because if you work with the tools, they are going to pretty much do it for you, and they are going to pretty much do it right. So they are not going like Blend, for example, doesn't have a slash text box. If the element is empty, it goes back to the self-closing one. So most of the time it's not, but really it doesn't impact your application at all.
Yep. So we're I like to be concise. So as in some cases you cannot, like when you have grids and borders, you definitely have to have an open element and then a bunch of children
if you have
of it,
content,
and then a closed element. So you won't have the choice. But that's just where we're at, and it's your choice.
Interesting.
We used to have there's a lot of practices out there. We used to have some white papers that I actually haven't revised in like 3 or 4 years that talk about best practices, naming conventions, and stuff like that. So maybe
for me, I think maybe as a closing thing, the best practice I can name is if you go into your tools options in Visual Studio, and there is a place where you can actually select for XAML the format that you want, and I don't know if we can switch to my screen quickly, but it's down there in the text editor. In the XAML, and here you have formatting spacing. What I love is have position each attribute on a separate line. And the reason is because when you merge, if you format your document automatically, each attribute will be neatly on a separate line. And then when you merge, you will see immediately what changed. Is that the margin that changed, or is that the width that changed? You have diff tools that do that. Once you have set this up, you can easily go into Edit, Advanced. I don't have a document open here, but Edit, Advanced, Format Document, and then you have it.
Control K, Control F.
KD.
It's a what?
D? No? Oh, it depends on the theme that you use.
Yeah, it might have been. It might be language specific.
I use Control K, Control D personally. Yeah.
So Control K, Control F is the one I use, and so yeah, and that's a really interesting thing because you can also control the spacing. Like by default it's 4 spaces, which I think is very readable.
Yeah,
but some people like to keep it tighter and they do 2 spaces. And the editor takes care of all that.
Some even go to tabs, but let's not go into that.
So,
all right.
So that's it for layout. We're going to take a break and we're going to come back at the top of the hours to kind of catch up a little bit. At 1 o'clock Pacific time, PST or PDT. So in 43 minutes or so, we will start again. And we're going to start with controls.
Yep.
So come back. It's going to be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy your meal for those who eat.